Hi everyone, welcome to the Masters Union podcast. Today we are hosting Professor Kenwyn Smith, one of the most renowned professors for organizational behavior from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Professor Smith just finished a week-long course on organizational psychology, leadership and group processes for the Masters Union students. In today's podcast, we'll get to know why one of the world's leading professors in organizational behavior doesn't believe in leaders. So, Kenwyn, thanks a lot for taking out the time and coming all the way to India and spending time with us. Let's start with a few questions. Now, you have been a professor who has taught across countries. Your students come from different nationalities, right? And the concepts that you teach of organizational behavior, psychology, have you seen any differences that occur because of cultural changes or the geographical changes, or you think the fundamentals kind of remain the same?
I see great variability from culture to culture. There are really strong imprinted logics in many cultures that are driven towards things like business or getting ahead or trying to make something be what it's actually not. And then there are other people who in cultures who are much more wed to nature, who are more identified with just the mere simple things of providing food for people, etc. So there are big differences from culture to culture. It's worth saying to you that I have a history that's kind of a little strange in that my first country I lived in for 1 year was Australia. In my second year was England. And then from 2 to 5, I lived in China. So Mandarin was my first language. At age 5, the family left during the revolution from China and went to Australia. That's where I grew up. And at some stage, I wandered into the United States, ended up at Yale, and then afterwards I've now spent a life in basically across the world.
Yeah.
Some of the things that I find is really very clear to me is that certain cultures express things only from an intellectual perspective. Others are much more affective in their life. Their expression of who they are comes from their heart more than their mind, and so on. One of the things that I find fascinating in India, because I've been coming for about 20 years now, is the juxtaposition of incredible curiosity, unbelievable tolerance for diversity. I got a profoundly significant historical and philosophical orientation to the world that is really very heavily imprinted for you all. And that enables a great deal. And there are parts of India that trip up over a number of things. And one of the things that surprises me the most is how much you have continued to carry on the colonial ways in which the British left you all.
Yeah.
So I see India as a nation which is growing very fast. It's only 75 years old or something like that in this incarnation. And sitting side by side with China, which I work in China as well, it's very clear that between the your two nations, India and China, the future of humanity rests in this next generation.
Yeah. Thank you, Kenwyn, for those words, and I kind of feel really proud right now to be an Indian, and that was probably the reason why I came back right after my MBA from US, because I see a great potential in Asia.
Sure.
And I think there's a lot of value to be added. Great. So you are going to take a course at Masters Union as well. Would love to understand what people can get out of this course.
Well, I think one of the things that is the most critical for all of us is learning how to learn. It's not just learning. It's kind of like learning how to learn.
Yeah.
It's easy to learn algebra. It's easy to learn whatever. But there are many things that are very hard to learn. But those are the things that really define the richness of one's life.
Yeah.
When I learned that this path for me is not right, I was shoved on it by context or family or something or other. I was obedient to it, but somehow or other it was eating away at my soul. That's a hard thing to learn.
Yeah.
And then it's even harder to learn as to how to get off that path and get onto a more appropriate path. And in the meantime, being able to have your friends and loved ones support you in that.
Yeah.
So I think that in this course, but for me as an educator, it is always about how do we learn how to learn. And I think, unfortunately, in formal education, those boundaries are very narrow. You're expected to learn algebra.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But you have to learn calculus. Really? How much do we use calculus in life?
I've never used it.
So there are many things that we feel that we have had imposed upon us because somebody thought that that was really important, and so on. So another thing I would say that is critical, and walking into the classroom and walking into an institution like this, all learning takes place on the cusp of our ignorance.
Yeah.
Nobody comes here to learn what we already know.
Yeah.
We don't come here to perform out in the world there. That's what is expected. But to be in a learning environment, it requires us to be attuned to what we don't know.
Yeah.
And have the courage to be able to express that this is something I don't understand. Would you help me, please?
Yeah.
And many, many people will defend against that because they feel embarrassed about what knowing. But if one have enough courage to do it, you'll probably find 15 people are very appreciative because they were feeling the same way as well. So this course, really to advance people's appreciation for what learning is all about, but not about the things that classically you would put in a graduate program, especially a business program. Because I think that the things that are destabling for the majority of people are relationships, the way they behave or in groups and the way groups behave, the way with groups that have interdependencies but don't have common cause to be highly relational and so on. So these kind of things are really things that organizations trip up over and over and over again. And so I'd like to offer to these folk some different paradigms because I think the standard ones don't work. And one of the ones that I think do not work is what is referred to as problem solving. I think in virtually every organization I ever go into, and I've gone into a lot of them, is that when a person says, this is the problem, and you really pay attention to it, it isn't the problem at all, it's the symptom. And people try to fix the symptom and don't come to recognize what the underlying cause or causes are. So I'd like to introduce these folk to some of those things and offer alternative ways to be thinking about those things that we refer to as problematic.
I think the one thing that you said, the idea is to learn how to learn, right? And I realized that, when you are in a college, when you are still very young, you're open, you're curious, and you want to go out there and, you want to learn. But when you go into a job and you have a work experience, sometimes, people start believing that they know everything. They have enough work experience, they have done enough jobs. And I've seen so many times when people move from one organization to another, they don't realize that they have to unlearn some of the ways in which the old organization worked. And they carry that with them, and it just becomes so difficult to fit in.
and they're never able to go to the root cause of that's the problem. I think this is the right way to think it because that was the norm in that organization, but maybe here the culture is different, right? So some of the things really resonate with me, and I'm super excited to take this course. I've enrolled in it, so would love to understand myself all of these. Also, I regret that when I was at Wharton, I couldn't take your course on Power Labs and small group processes, both very famous courses. Can you tell us a little bit about those and what we're bringing from there to here?
It's worth appreciating that this grew out of race relations in the United States in the very early 1970s, where at some stage, colleague of mine, a beloved mentor, thought that it would be really useful to ask Black people to walk in white people's shoes and vice versa. Soon after trying that, it was clear that none of these things are binaries, Black and white. It requires another force in there, and that's a mediating force between the black and whiteness. And invariably, those conversations are filled with power differentials. So the white person who basically has been in the upper position has a sense of power and confidence and doesn't really need to know very much about what the Black person's life is like to get by. Whereas the Black person in the American setting needs to know everything they possibly can about whiteness, because if they don't know that, it'll probably get them into trouble, and everything they need to know about Blackness as well.
Yeah.
So guess who's wise? The Black person.
Yeah.
Guess who's ignorant?
Yeah.
The white person.
True.
So starting a long time ago, we created really, we'd take away people to a retreat setting, probably for about 5 or 6 days. And we'd have some people who'd be the elites, and some people who'll be the outs, and some people who'll be the middles. And the elites get everything that they need. The outs get almost nothing. And the middles feel torn and battered between the elites and the outs. We allow this to, it's always designed around some kind of theme. So if something's going on in the world, we may appropriate that theme, like migration or catastrophe or something or other.
Yeah.
And this is a lived experience that goes on for several days. There are patterns that occur over and over and over again. And it's a way of people learning to discover that if you're in a powerful position, you feel powerless.
Okay.
If you are in a bottom position, you probably feel the need to bond with each other because for them, the world is a threat. And so if they're not going to be fed, they're not going to be given anything, and they may be treated in an unkindly way, guess what happens?
Yeah.
They throw out all their differences and they bond like crazy.
Correct.
And they begin to become a little paranoid because they recognize that their bond is dependent upon the threat that's coming from here or the perceived threat or the imaginary threat. And it may not even be there at all, but they'll see it.
Yeah.
And that seeing it, which may be fictitious, becomes a force because if they take away the threat,
Then
guess what happens?
The bonding goes away.
Disintegrates.
Yeah.
So if they are threatening us, we better stay together
Yeah.
so that we can
combat
survive.
that. Yeah.
And if they're not threatening us, we better stay together because we won't survive because we'll have lost the bond.
Yeah.
That comes out all the time. If you provide for them not much food or accommodation, these outs do absolutely fine. They will always find food.
Okay.
They will always find
They'll work
accommodation.
together to find out.
They're brilliant at it. But if you deprive them of information, don't tell them terribly much. If you do that, then it is very probable that they'll come up with a conspiracy theory.
Because they feel that you are conspiring because you're not sharing information.
Well, if you're not hearing anything, they will think that the sky is going to fall in. Now, nothing may be happening.
Yeah.
But because there's nothing's happening, then you're expecting something's about to happen. So you better defend against it. And it increases their intensity. Always, too, between the elites and the outs is the question about how the middles are going to align. Are they going to align with the elites, or are they going to align with the outs? And they're invariably bouncing around. If perchance they align with the outs, there'll be a revolution.
Yeah, because then they have like the outs have a support with the middles who have a little bit more power.
Right. So I'm not going to say any more, because if you're coming to it tomorrow, you're going to hear one of these stories, and I don't think I should presage it for you.
No, but I mean, whatever you've said, I already stories kind of go through my mind saying, hey, this person and this person bond together because they might be feeling that, they have the same boss and they may not be liking that and all of that. So, no, great. And I look forward to knowing more about it. Now, changing gears a little bit, right? Let's talk about psychology in the workplace. Now, I'm sure you've taught so many leaders. You have so many examples. There are some common behavioral issues or ways that exist in companies and are most prevalent, and that restricts organizations to achieve their full potential. So what are some of those things, and how can organization kind of, take that aside and reach their full potential?
So I'm going to reframe the question for you. I don't think there are leaders. There are people who get designated as being called leaders, and others may treat them as leaders, but I don't think there are leaders.
Okay.
I think there's a phenomenon, and the phenomenon is leadership. However, leadership is completely dependent upon followership, and followership is dependent upon leadership. You can't have leadership without followership, and you can't have followership without leadership. If you are in a position of authority and can take major actions, and the workforce doesn't comply, nothing happens. Maybe they get fired, or maybe there's a rebellion. But so when you look at the 100 years of writing in managerial and organizational studies about leaders, the majority of people throw out a good portion of the variance in the phenomenon because they're not paying attention to the followership at all. I don't know. I haven't bothered to look at it in the last 20 years. But probably for every 1,000 studies on leadership, you'll find one on followership.
True.
And unless you're looking at the relational components of it, it's a completely vacuous phenomenon. And it isn't necessary when you say if a person is a leader, they may be a leader in this particular portion of the organization, on this particular skill set or whatever, and be completely useless at this.
In the other.
And so I think that leadership and followership is everywhere in organizations all the time. And when I encounter workers, my experience is that they are exercising more meaningful leadership and followership than the executives actually do.
Fair.
I'm sorry to all you bosses who have a different orientation, but you asked me and I'm telling you my truth.
Completely. And I'll follow that up with saying that I am at a leadership position, right? I may not be a leader, to use your vocabulary, but then in that leadership position, how can one make sure that you're keeping your employees motivated, you have a strong followership in the right way?
So I don't know. I stopped reading these books, but for decades after decades after decades, people wrote books on how to motivate
Yeah.
the unmotivated worker. I've never seen an unmotivated worker. I've seen workers who have been so disheartened, have been so under-resourced, have been so exploited, that there come moments where they stop caring. And their stop caring is a byproduct of how they've been treated. So I think that the phenomena is not in the workforce. I think it is in the leadership, because they have aspirations for things happening which the workforce can never really achieve. However, it's more complicated than that, because the people who are senior in the organization, they have a task which is very, very complicated. And the complication is they're being asked to look into the future.
Yes.
To be able to see what could happen in 3 months, in 6 months, in 10 years, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
That is impossible to know. There may be little suggestions, little markers that this is possible, but that kind of thinking is very abstract and very hard to actually crystallize.
Yeah.
But leadership does have that responsibility, and that responsibility includes making sure that the outside world matches the inside world and the vice versa.
Yeah.
Most people in leadership have no sophistication in expressing this to the workforce. And at the workforce level, it's just simply, what's the task? What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
You want me to build the wall here, or do you want me to build the wall there? We
Correct.
haven't decided. You ought to find out yourself what is. Okay, we decided to do it. We'll do it this way.
Correct.
Oh, the leadership, we didn't want you to do it that way. Why didn't you tell us before? And that goes on over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And when the workforce becomes a little upset about this and want to be a little bit, look what you're doing, the bosses blame the workers for being disobedient workers.
Correct.
I think the concept of motivation in the workforce I think it's garbage.
So you're saying people start off as motivated because everybody wants to do well and have the right intent. But when you go through experiences that upset you
Over and over again,
then you reach a point here,
Sure.
you're like, I don't care anymore.
Sure.
Let them do what they decide. Fair. And what are one of the biggest myths you've said is that there are no unmotivated workers, but what are some of the biggest myths or misconceptions about psychology or organizational behavior as a whole?
Well, psychology is a very complex profession.
Yeah.
There are probably 40 different versions of it in the American Psychological Society, for example.
Yeah.
So there are profoundly significant things for people at an individual level. And probably all of us need help to reflect upon the things that we're going through in our life.
Yeah.
If you're fortunate enough to have loved ones who can do that for you in a supportive way, that's great. But those who don't have that available might often need to get some kind of help.
Yeah.
So there's that, which is merely just life adaptation that just needs a little bit of a prop, through to people who seriously have pathological dynamics within their beingness. So for some people, I'm not going to go through the various things, it's just thousands of them.
Sure.
But there are certain conditions that people end up tumbling into that are really very, very hard to deal with. Bipolar, for example, which is very difficult to get medicine exactly in a decent balance. There's good medicine, but it's got to be balanced very carefully. So there's that at the individual level. Through to organizations. Now, the phenomena of organizations is kind of interesting because it's very hard to actually state clearly what an organization is. If you were to pick any organization in this building here, you say, well, what's the organization? Is the organization just the people who work here? Is the organization the people who on the supply chain?
Yeah.
Are they the customers? Are they the investors? I mean,
Sure.
What's the organization?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that happens a lot in English vocabulary is to constantly turn to turn verbs into nouns. And I think the phenomena is not organizations. I think it's about organizing. And when you think about organizing, we're all organizing all the time.
Yes.
Like, I need to cook the evening meal. I go home, I don't see that this particular configuration of vegetables was there. So I improvise, I reorganize the meal.
Yeah.
And back in the days when I was feeding the kids just like Sarah would split all that work. I would always be making sure that I have one agenda, that there's at least something on that plate that each kid loved, so that they didn't get upset, etc. So that's organizing.
Correct.
So we're all organizing all the time. What most people don't recognize is that people who are in marginalized setting are doing a lot more organizing minute by minute by minute than people who are in much more resource settings.
Correct.
So it's much more organizing there, but not really recognized. And I worked in the nonprofit world for a very long time, and I've seen it over and over and over again.
Because there's so many constraints there that you keep running into that you have to change your plan and then you have to reorganize.
Minute by minute. Yeah.
Yeah. Fair.
Runaway kids, for example. What are you going to do today? Depends on which kid ran away.
True, absolutely. Great. And there is, we keep hearing a lot about, it's not about IQ, it's about EQ, right? So, of course, emotional intelligence play a critical part in leadership. But can this be inculcated? Is it something that's natural and everybody has a different EQ level?
Well, let me start by saying that I think that many of these measurement tools that have been established in terms of personality profiles, forget about EQ or even IQ.
Yeah.
What on earth is IQ, for crying out loud? What is it? It's just a set of questions that people answer in particular ways. And somebody made the decision that you need to be able to answer these questions. Then you have people who live on a spectrum, for example, and because they live on a spectrum, they don't do terribly well on IQ. But many of those people are absolute geniuses.
Yeah.
If only they could mobilize their energies, and that requires extra supports and so on.
Yeah.
So I'm not a great fan of the notion of intelligence, even in period.
Fair.
You will hear me say this tomorrow if you're going to be in this class, that this person may be very intelligent in doing astrophysics and may be very unintelligent in being a parent.
Yeah, true.
How do you measure these sort of things? Which are the more important?
Yeah.
And so on. So I view intelligent quotients and so on with a skeptical orientation. When it comes to emotional, I think that there are lots of things that have been plopped on scales that on this end, this is good. On this end, this is bad. Or not appropriate or not appropriate. But there are many things where these are both and, they're not either ors. So I would give, for example, give any test to me about EQ, and I will look right plumb in the middle as average. I am very introverted and very extroverted at the same time. And my extroversion is born of my introversion, and my introversion is born of my extroversion. Both and. And it's always context as to how I'm behaving and how I'm not behaving.
Yeah.
Alter the context, and it will alter very fast.
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan
Not a fan of these measures.
of these measures, definitely.
Fair. So one last question before we move to the rapid fire is, we have a lot of students here who are preparing for the real world. They're right now somewhere in the middle, transitioning from high school to real world, and they have time here, or people doing their MBAs and will be soon going into the real world. What is that one advice you want to give to them, which they should keep in mind while they're behaving in those organizations and in those leadership positions?
I think in terms of lasting success, it's about how a person sees the world. Many people look at the world through dark glasses. Other people maybe need different glasses. So I think that in the final analysis, it's all about learning to see the variations of things that we glob together and see them as just one kind and so on. So that would be one thing I would say. Another one thing I'd say, though, is to be open to listen to what not just your rational brain is saying, but what the paradoxical brain is saying, and what the brain of the heart is saying. All three.
Yeah.
That's very hard to pull off. An 18-year-old, not likely to, they're still in their teens where everything's jumbled. I have no idea how anybody survives
those
teenagehood.
years.
Yeah, right, because you grow fast and you're intellectually tripping over yourself.
And you're trying to form a personality. You don't know
Sure,
who
don't
you
even
are.
know what it is. So that's very different than a person who's in their early 30s, for example.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
I'd say different things to different people.
Different to different. Yeah. But when you talk about the brain of the heart, is it what we say, hey, this is what my gut is saying? Is that the same thing?
No. I think, well, of course, the brain, the emotional system is here.
Yeah.
And we're not really paying attention to this mostly. But it distresses us and we get it in the gut.
Yeah.
And we're pointing to the wrong place. It wasn't your gut, it was here.
It was here,
of course.
course.
It's just, and everything's so interconnected.
Correct.
That this is one of the sensitive places where it can show up.
Correct.
But this is a symptom. That's not a cause.
This is a symptom. Absolutely. Okay, great. Now, I think I learned a lot in this conversation and looking forward to learning more in the course. I just have a few questions for you as a rapid fire from our students. So are you ready, Kenwyn, for the
Fire
rapid fire? Great. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Curious, loving, and aspiring.
Okay, great. And if you were not in the current profession, what else would you be doing?
No idea.
No idea. Okay. Your role...
Oh, I should say, I'm not even sure that I know what profession I'm in. I must confess.
True.
Because I think of myself as a social scientist, as a social artist, as a social historian, and as a social theologian. All four.
Fair. Absolutely. One source of inspiration that you have. Could be a person, could be a thing, could be a place.
I have 3 wonderful, wonderful friends who I never met in my life. Abraham Lincoln,
Okay.
Gandhi, and Mandela.
Okay.
I can have conversations in my head with them very easily.
Do you want to elaborate on these 3?
It's for some other time.
Okay, great. And the last one, places that you would love to visit again and again.
My family, about 20 years ago, had the opportunity to buy a little shack on a lake in the Adirondacks in the upstate of New York. And it is I live in Philadelphia, but my home is in the Adirondacks.
So we would love to go back to home again and again.
Oh, I do it every year.
Awesome. Great. Well, that brings us to the end of this podcast. And Kenwyn, I must appreciate the honesty with which you gave the answers. And I hope I didn't ask a lot of questions. I'm assuming our students are going to ask more questions in the course starting tomorrow. But thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.